empire.
Right.
This cannot stand.
This country.
Yeah,
this country was founded on it, right? Like,
right? This country supposedly was founded on the idea that tyranny cannot stand. So we're going to fight you and build our own place. Just so happened that said own place already belonged to indigenous Americans who you killed off and who you, again, marginalized and maligned to get what you believed was divinely yours, right? And then you stole African labor to build the country that you said you were building yourself. Now, we can go on and on about that, but the point is, we know it's not possible for this to continue. The question is, how, are we going to address the roots of the issue, or are we going to keep tinkering around the edges and treating the symptoms and coming back over and over again to this insidious illness and let it keep taking us over?
I was going to go to the last question about how we know we're getting close. But before we get there, you just touched on two things that are connected. You started off talking about, like, you know, the policing in places like Ferguson, and not just Ferguson, all over this country, where whole city and county budgets are funded off our bodies, right? You know, I used to live in Selma. That's where Latasha and I met. And my wife and I, we lived there for 10 years. And my wife was actually a municipal judge. And she wound up basically being replaced by the same mayor that had appointed her. But what happened was she had the audacity to go in there and try to run the court a different kind of way. We used to always say, and you go to any city in this country, any small town, whatever, and there's always a municipal day, like traffic and citations and all that. And you go in there and it's full of Black folks. Even if you can take a city, a town, whatever, that's maybe 40, 50% Black, but you go in on that municipal day, it's 95, 97, 98 Black folks in there. And so she was doing some transformative justice that led the mayor to basically say, you know what, we're not collecting enough. You dismissing too much stuff. You giving too much diversionary stuff. You know,
he wanted that revenue.
He wanted that revenue, right? Yeah. And so I think about that in the intersections, and this is something that we talk a lot about when we talk about Black Power. The intersections of, like, the economics and the politics of it all. And even the other part that you were just talking about the founding of this country and the theft of the land and, you know, the kidnapping of our folks, that intersection of the economics and the politics of it all. What as you think about all these issues that we're dealing with, right? And all the great work that's taking place. How do you think about that intersection of, we've got these political battles, we've got these economic battles. There's some folks that say you gotta fight the cultural part first, or else you can't even get to the political or the economic. Like, what's your thoughts about the ways that these different strategies have intersected historically and how we need to be navigating them now?
I think when we're at our best, we are incredible multitaskers. We are fighting on the economic front. We are fighting on the political front. We are securing ourselves on the spiritual and moral front. And we are fighting on the cultural front. I don't believe that any of those exist in silos. Cultural conversations can shift policy outcomes, right? We saw that happen for marriage equality. There are many, many more issues of LGBTQ liberation, especially for our queer family of color and Black queer loved ones, that need to be taken on, right? That did not begin and end with marriage equality. So how are we both pushing on the cultural conversations while we are also pushing on the economic conversations, the moral and spiritual conversations, and the policy outcomes, right? And I think often of when Kimberly Crenshaw talks about intersectionality and us understanding what it means to have systems intersect in the lives of people who bear more than one marginalized identity, I think often about how we build sufficient outcomes and not just efficient outcomes. And in order to do that, I have to consider the most marginalized. I have to consider the most intersectionally maligned and oppressed, right? So I think often of Black disabled people and Black trans women, right? And we know that those are also identities that can intersect therein, right? But when you look at the realities of life for Black trans women, for example, some of the highest rates of homicide and suicide, some of the highest rates of houselessness and joblessness, right? Those are spiritual, cultural issues, right? That have everything to do with mental health, communities of support, but also with identity and being accepted in the world so that you don't feel like you have to hide yourself and that you are not hunted by people who act like it is a threat to be seen with you. But this is also an economic issue. If you can't find a job while being who you truly are, and if you finally get that job, you are underpaid in said job. So, I think of this conversation that has been happening for the last 2 weeks about the Dave Chappelle special on Netflix and Netflix's response. And how I watched a lot of Black people in particular want to say, oh, white people are just trying to tear up a Black man down. And I'm sitting here going, there are Black LGBTQ folks, Preston Mitchum, Angelica Ross, David Johns, who are writing the articles and getting on television and writing the tweets that are telling you this is not white people, this is me. I'm supposed to be your sibling. I'm supposed to be your loved one. You're supposed to be fighting for my liberation too. And I'm telling you that this pains me too. Because culturally, when the conversation is that I'm not who I really am, it is easy to then extend violence toward me. What, of course, is ironic is that there's another piece of content that sits on Netflix's platform called Disclosure. And Disclosure is probably the most important film I watched in all of quarantine last year. Disclosure talks about how media depictions and entertainment depictions of trans people, trans characters, trans characterizations have directly contributed to the violence and continual economic and physical harm that trans people across the world have faced. So many things that I had never even thought of or associated. That documentary was able to help me connect the dots, right? Understanding that if I'm constantly seeing on television this idea that a trans person is somehow evil or weird or out of sorts, right? Or somehow mentally deranged, right? If that message is continuously being driven. And the idea that a trans woman is just a man playing dress up. You put those two ideas together, then you get what's called the trans panic defense, where someone who kills a trans woman will get in a courtroom and say, I was scared because this man was about to attack me, instead of understanding that they were dealing with a trans woman, right? So the dots are
version of I saw there was a Black man and I was
exactly.
afraid for my life, right? Like
because we got understand that. Exactly,
right.
Because we got depicted as these violent, lawless apes for so long,
right,
that it's now easy for a police officer or a George Zimmerman or the people who killed Ahmaud Arbery to say,
right,
Trayvon Martin was so much bigger than me. That was a child.
Right.
Michael Brown Jr. was a child. Tamir Rice was a child.
Right.
Breonna Taylor was a young woman, right? So exactly, right? The parallels are clear. So the cultural conversation has just as much to do with the economic, the policy, the physical, the spiritual outcomes for marginalized people. So what does that mean? That means as we build solutions, as we build new policies, as we build new economic structures, as we challenge cultural ideas, and as we give people spaces for spiritual and moral healing, if we do that with the most marginalized in mind, with Black trans folks in mind, with Black disabled folks who also disproportionately suffer from joblessness and houselessness, et cetera, if we build solutions for all four of those areas with them in mind, guess what? Those solutions will actually work for everybody. They'll work for Black cisgender women like me, right? They'll work for Black able-bodied men like my husband, right? They'll work for white women. They'll work for white men, as long as we understand that this power is ours to share and not to hoard. And I think that that is how I try most often to think about the intersection between all of those pieces, which is why sometimes I'm pushing on the economic model. Sometimes I'm pushing on the policy piece. Sometimes the podcast for me is about the cultural conversation. It's about how we can shift mindset so that when you go out into the world and you run some of these systems, you're doing it differently, right? I don't think that it can be that we're ever fighting on just one front, because the threat to us is not just on one front. So we have to be prepared to be incredible multitaskers. That doesn't mean that one person has to do all the things, but it means that as a community, we have to be linked arm in arm, taking on all of those sides.
Just that whole conversation about the ways that we replicate, and it's not just in the sphere of like the way that we treat our trans communities. There's other aspects of it, right? We saw some of the same stuff with R. Kelly, right? Some of the language and the excusing and all of that. In the same language of, oh, you just trying to pull down a black man, right? But the ways that we replicate some of the same power dynamics.
That's right.
And some of the same rationales.
That's right.
That have been used against us.
That's
but
right.
The ways that sometimes we replicate that within our group is mind-boggling.
It is. And yet it is part of what we have ingested. Beverly Daniel Tatum calls white supremacy culture. A, that it's a culture. And B, that it is a smog that we all breathe in. The question is constantly, what are we all doing to expel the smog from our lungs? Because the longer that smog stays in there, the easier it becomes for me to transfer my oppression to other people. The easier it becomes for Black men to transfer their oppression to Black women, for Black cis women to transfer their oppression to Black trans women. Like, this is how it goes for Black wealthy folks to transfer their oppression to Black poor folks, right? And I think that there is a great temptation that white supremacy dangles in front of us. That if you can just be proximate to whiteness or have a life that mimics whiteness, then you've suddenly arrived, right? If you can make enough money, if you can get the right title, if you can have the approval of enough white people, that you have arrived. You've survived the great racist experiment. We know that that's not true. OJ said, I'm not Black, I'm OJ. Well, as Jay-Z said, okay, we see how that worked out for you, right?
Right.
It may not have caught up with you back in the 90s, but it's caught up with you, my brother, right? It caught up with you as soon as you went back to Brentwood and you thought all of your white neighbors were going to celebrate your homecoming, and they did not, my guy.
Nope.
They did not. And white supremacy culture dangles that temptation in front of us. It's on us to reject that. It's on us to say, I'm already culturally rich. It's on us to say, I know what I deserve materially from this country, and I'm going to go fight for it. It is on us to reject the notion that being like them is freedom. And it is on us to reject the idea that subjugating somebody else is going to set us more free, because it does the exact opposite.
That's right. That white gaze, as Toni Morrison used to say, that white gaze is a hell of a drug.
It is.
I could talk to you all day about these issues.
Likewise.
But the last question, and I always say it's the hardest question, really, at least for me. How do we know all that we've talked about, all these different intersections, all these different strategies and lessons learned? How do we know that we're getting closer to Black power? Like, what is it? How do we know? How do you know when you wake up any given morning that you're able to say, I feel like we're a step closer to it, that this is the way that I think about the kind of impact that I'm having in terms of trying to build Black power? How do we know?
I think so much of it can be measured in the freedom of Black children. I say this as a former educator. I used to teach third grades. 8 and 9-year-olds still love school. They still love their teacher, but they're also becoming the people that they will be. And they're being confronted with the ills of the world in brand new ways. And I have worked with young people for long enough to feel like I have witnessed the moments when they have felt their own genius being threatened. And I say that, and that's not esoteric for me, right? That's not just some kind of high-flying idea for me. Ultimately, when I see thriving Black children, I see thriving Black communities. I see communities that have the resources that they need. I see communities that are experiencing the material conditions that allow for everyone to be healthy and well. I see communities that are having loving cultural and spiritual conversations and healing the hurts within, healing that internalized oppression, healing that internalized sexism, healing that internalized marginalization. I see communities that are building our own institutions, not because we've been forced out of others, but because we recognize we have everything we need in us to survive. And we want to